Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give you a minute as people join, and we'll get started in probably a minute or two. Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. We have a lot to cover today, and I'm going to turn on my video and invite all my fellow speakers to also turn on theirs. And I'm going to, let's see. Yes. All right. Let me make sure I can see. Yes, we've got all the videos on. Okay, let's get started. Rubia, could you go to our first slide? Okay, so welcome everyone, wherever you're calling from, whether it's morning, afternoon, or middle of the night, as I know it is for some of our speakers here today. This webinar is a deep dive into the UFLPA. But I want to sort of contextualize this a little bit before we get started. It is based on the resource, the Apparel Suppliers Guide to Sustainability Legislation in the US, EU, and UK. And that guide is made up of fact sheets. And one of the fact sheets is on the UFLPA. So that's what we will be discussing today. So if you haven't looked at the fact sheet, I'll put the QR code up in a minute to download it. But we really recommend that you do that. And this Apparel Suppliers Guide, which I just mentioned, I want to say a little bit about this project because it's quite special, I think. It is a guide that was led and commissioned by a group of manufacturers, Diamond, Lenzing, Pactics, and we have a representative from Pactics here with us today, Linda, Poetic Gem, and we have Kavita here today with us from Poetic Gem, Shahi Exports, and from Shahi we have Kritika, who will be one of the main presenters for today, and we also have her colleague Gori, who you will see in a moment. Simple Approach, and then Sourcery, and we also have Ruchita here with us from Sourcery today. And this project it was led by these manufacturers, and it was also supported by Transformers Foundation and GIZ Fabric. And I'm here on behalf of Transformers Foundation today. The report was written by the Remedy Project. The Remedy Project, they are lawyers. And so each of the fact sheets in this report was written by the legal team at the Remedy Project. The Remedy Project was, if there are people attending who have participated previous deep dive webinars on different pieces of legislation, the Remedy Project in the past has been the one to present the fact sheets, but today we are very fortunate to have Harold with us, and I'll introduce him in a moment. But Harold has a lot of very practical and on-the-ground experience with the UFLPA, and so I think that will really add a lot of value to this conversation. I will introduce Harold properly in a moment, as well as Patricia. The last thing I'll say just about the project in general is that the opinions expressed in this webinar or the report are that of the collective. So all of these manufacturers working together on this initiative and shouldn't be attributed to the individual companies or spokespeople. Rubia, next slide, please. So as I've mentioned already, this resource is intended to enable manufacturers who are predominantly operating outside of the global north to better understand how recent and upcoming sustainability related legislation will impact them. And as I mentioned, it's special. It's the first of its kind. It's a supplier-led public policy resource. And we hope that this resource will build more supplier collaboration and agency within policy discourse. Next slide, please. Okay. So if you are interested in this guide, if you think it's meaningful and valuable, support future fact sheets, you can do that by downloading the report. That's the first QR code you see on the screen. Support future fact sheets, that's the middle QR code you see on the screen, or register for our next deep dive webinar. The next one will be about the EU eco-design fact sheet. Rubia, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the main speakers for today, a bit of housekeeping, and then I'm going to get on with it. But if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A as we go along. We'll get to questions at the end, but you are more than welcome to put your questions in as we go. From a structure perspective, we're going to hear from Harold first, then from Kritika, and then from Patricia. And Harold will be presenting sort of what the UFLPA actually says and his experience with how it's actually playing out on the ground. And Kritika will be sharing a little bit about how Shahi Exports is preparing for this piece of legislation. And Patricia has been supporting Shahi in their preparation, so we'll speak a little bit to that. So Harold Grunfeld is a lawyer, and he's here from GDLSK. I always find it a bit of a tongue twister, GDLSK. And it is 3:30 in the morning or something like that for him, so please be kind. And Patricia, as I mentioned, is here. It says Responsible Sourcing Network on screen. That's kind of the umbrella entity. The main sort of project that they've been working on as it relates to this is called the YES Initiative, which stands for, it's the Yarn Ethically and Sustainably Sourced Initiative. And so that's, and as I mentioned, they've been working closely with Shahi Exports on sort of preparing for this piece of legislation. So with that, I am going to hand over to Harold, and I invite everybody else to turn off their mics and their.
Hey, good morning or good evening or whatever time it is. I would appreciate your being kind. It's 4 o'clock in the morning, and I'll do the best I can to stay awake and make this presentation worthwhile for you. Our law firm is a trade law firm. All we do is customs and trade, and the presentation this morning is really going to be based on our experiences over the last year or more in dealing with detentions by U.S. Customs, the practical sides, the things that you need to understand in terms of the procedure, and how obviously to prepare. Patricia will be doing we'll have a discussion on documentation, and I'll try and keep my comments in that regard relatively simple. So let's go to the first slide for a moment. Actually, the second slide, please. Okay, so you have all by now heard about UFLPA and the fact that it is a statute that provides for the rejection of merchandise in the United States if it is made with forced labor. There are really two important takeaways from it, and we can go to the second slide as well. And that is, A, if goods are made within the Xinjiang province, there is a presumption that those goods are made with forced labor. It is a very significant burden to disprove that. And what's more important to understand is that no matter how much proof you present, and even if customs should accept it, they must report to Congress if they give you a waiver. So you have a significantly complicated process, which we will get into in a few moments in terms of presenting proof that goods aren't made with forced labor. And secondly, the burden of understanding that a customs official who grants your petition to release the goods must report that to Congress. That's not a career advancing situation, and trying to overcome this burden is virtually impossible. On the second side of all of this, if your goods are not made in Xinjiang, then you are faced with the process of proving that the goods were not made with forced labor. In doing so, you're faced with having to prove a negative. That's a very difficult process. It's not only a question of demonstrating where your goods were made and how your goods were made, but proving that anywhere in the supply chain that the goods were not tainted by some component that was made by forced labor. So you've got a dual burden of proving something and proving that something didn't happen. Okay. So the UFLPA is a statute that is really well intended. There is a noble cause in trying to avoid forced labor in the production of goods to the developed countries of the world. However, in its interpretation and in its application, it probably, in my view, represents one of the most significant trade barriers to that I have ever seen in my years of practice, and that is 50 years. Customs under this statute has the ability, unfettered opportunity to stop goods coming from anywhere in the world where there is a suspicion that it is based on forced labor. So Customs has its own methodologies for investigating. They're using artificial intelligence in reviewing bills of lading and reviewing transit documents. They receive information from various non-governmental agencies that are committed to the elimination of forced labor. And they have developed an entities list for companies that they have found to be violating the forced labor rules. However, they can also stop goods based on intelligence that is not made public. If they believe an entity may have a forced labor issue, but doesn't appear on the entity's list, they can still stop shipments. So what we're faced with is trying to develop our chains of production and trying to examine all elements of our production, and yet deal with customs that has its own methodology for gathering information, which it doesn't make public, and trying to speculate why the government may issue a detention notice. Why don't we go to the next slide, please? One more, sorry. One more. Okay, this is a notice that you would receive if your goods were subject to detention. It's obviously a legal document. It outlines the basis by which they detain goods. It's a lot of legalese, but stop right here. This is fine. But once you get through the first couple of pages of it, the slide you're looking at now is the beginning of a process that you need to be able to go through in order to try and get release of detained goods. So if you remember earlier, I said part of all of this is proving a negative. The documents that are outlined here and the documents that are outlined in the slide below, if you'll just go forward a little bit, okay. So there is a requirement to provide full production records, and specifically with regard to cotton, identifying where the cotton comes from down to the bale is the published standard. And what is necessary to provide to customs is the full scope of documents that are outlined above, as well as the actual sourcing going down to cotton bales. The question I've always asked is, what is the relevance of providing workers' records in a factory that is well past the stage of cotton production? And because they have made this process so cumbersome, that if we can just go flip back up to the last slide, right here. So when you get into shipping records, that makes sense. We want to see where things come from. But production records and inventory records are very complicated sets of documents that customs will examine with a microscope, checking every date, checking every detail. And to the extent that factories don't necessarily keep records in the manner in which customs would like to see them, it creates a significant problem if a proper plan hasn't been established with the factory base so that they're able to provide all of this data, much of it which has nothing to do with cotton. And therein lies part of the problem. We have been in the midst of dozens, if not more, of detentions outside of the apparel world, although there have been some apparel as well, where we've ended up having to produce thousands of documents relating to every component, to every raw material that was utilized in the production of a product, in order to satisfy the inquiries by customs. And in addition to that, we've provided summaries of every section that we provide. You must provide translations. And it's a very, very detailed and cumbersome process. And customs may or may not interact with you, which is one of the things that you need to consider. And it will take 3 or 4 months to be able to effect a release if you're on a fast track. So documents get submitted. There are discussions with customs, hopefully. If you're fortunate, you will receive guidance from the detaining officer who will tell you what he or she thinks may be missing from your presentation, or will tell you where they have run into problems. We've seen situations where the problems that they have pointed out have absolutely nothing to do with whether or not forced labor exists. It may be discrepancies in dates between payment records and shipping documents. It may be discrepancies in inventory records. And customs' view is that if the documents submitted have these kinds of flaws, the documents themselves may not be credible. And without even getting to the question of whether or not there is forced labor, they may actually reject the shipment on on the basis of credibility of documents. Every importer or every factory is going to have to maintain um, records in a new way today in order to be able to meet these challenges, which certainly is something that is going to be discussed a bit later in this presentation. But as an importer, or as I recommend that all of our clients do a certain level of mock detentions with their key vendors in order to determine whether or not the documents that can be produced will be satisfactory to customs. And oftentimes we will correct and go through the documents, provide advice to the factories as to what should be changed or how they can adapt their records to the situation. It's also important to understand that there are rules in China that prohibit factories from providing information in connection with forced labor. And as we have found in a number of situations, as we try to get more detailed information from various levels in the production chain, the answer is we can't provide this, it would violate Chinese law. So that is a separate obstacle that needs to be dealt with. It's really, we think, very important for the importer to have direct contact with his vendors and to work with them through in establishing the chain of production and the processes by which their manufacturers are acquiring raw materials and who they acquire raw materials from. Whether it's lawyers or consultants or whomever who are trying to put these packages together, oftentimes it's the importer themselves and their interaction with their vendors that make the difference in terms of how documents get prepared and how documents are presented. So when a detention takes place, an importer and factory really need to evaluate how best to proceed. And the first question is, do you have a proper record retention program? And does it take you through the various levels of production, down through whether it be dyeing, whether it be knitting, whether it be weaving, all the way back? And can it take you back at least to the bale in terms of tracing, and can you trace upwards from the bale to the final production? If you haven't got if you haven't got that, then you seriously have to consider, maybe we don't want to respond to a detention. Maybe we simply want to bring the goods back to wherever we've exported it from and work towards establishing a proper program that can respond to all of this. One of the things we advise clients regularly is, if your documents are not going to be acceptable, or if they're weak and we don't think that they will be sustained with customs, then bite the bullet, bring the goods back, and start again. Because it's highly unlikely that a document package that is weak will get past customs and result in the release of a detained shipment. It's also important to understand, as you enter into this process, that it will take months to resolve. Irrespective of how quickly you can put documents together, and I would suggest it takes a minimum of a week or two, if the documents are submitted to customs, it generally will take them a month or two to review. That's before any questions arise or any issues are faced. We think it's important to interact with customs from the commencement of the process. Um, Speaking to the import specialist that's going to review your shipment, offering to answer any questions, being available to them if they have any issues. Oftentimes, they don't understand certain things in the documents, and which can result in a detention or an exclusion. Sometimes some clear talking with them and explanations will avoid that kind of problem. Um, then, then comes the question of what do you do if you're going to find yourself in a situation where goods are excluded? There's always the option of litigation. Litigation is expensive and very complex and takes a significant amount of time. So the reality is, unless you have a major production facility that is being questioned by customs, which results in a significant impact on your business, litigation is not an answer. It's bring your goods back to wherever they were shipped from and start again. By start again, it means trying to understand where in the production chain customs may have found a problem, and using other vendors who may not have the same problems is also an option. We never get a straight answer from customs as to who in the chain has created the problem or what in the chain has created the problem. So sometimes factory one uses suppliers A, B, and C, and factory two will use suppliers D, E, and F, and that may actually give you an opportunity to ship goods from factory two, even though factory one has had a problem, or even factory one where they have multiple suppliers and use different suppliers as well. So trial and error, while it's expensive, may be one of the options that you have. I think I am okay. There's one important thing that needs to be considered with cotton, and I think I'm out of time, but this is important. It's the notion of commingling. And customs will look to the production capacity of a factory that's being used. And even if all of the documentation relating to cotton and the bales and even the farmers is provided, customs has been known to say, well, wait a minute, we have heard this factory buys other cotton from from Xinjiang, and how do we know it hasn't been commingled? And this is proving a negative to the highest degree. It is absolutely impossible to prove that cotton hasn't been commingled. Even, we've got the bale numbers. We can show you that we bought those bales. We can show you those bales were bought from areas outside of Xinjiang, but we can't show that there's no way to prove that the factory did not commingle with other cotton that came from Xinjiang. Now, there are two possibilities. You may have a reasonable customs examiner, in which case, if you've gone down to the bale level and everything else in your record keeping is clean, then they may release the goods, but they may not. And that's within their prerogative. And that is really part of the larger problem that we deal with. The other is how far back to go. Customs has articulated that they want to go back to the bales. In a discussion with them on a recent detention, they said, well, maybe we'd like to see the data from the farmers. We've had situations with regard to um, other products which are made from silicon, where they've said we want to see where the sand came from. There is nothing that precludes the customs examiner for asking for any of this information, most of which is almost impossible to provide. So, in summary, I think I would say you need to have a good plan, and I'm sure you're going to hear about that shortly. You need to interact with customs. You need to provide them with submissions that are translated, that are annotated, and that are complete. And finally, you need to be a bit lucky that you get an examiner who is reasonable as opposed to those who are not. With that, I will keep quiet. I've probably spoken for far too long, but thank you.
No, thank you very much, Harold. I think it's really insightful, and it's really helpful to have the insights from somebody who's been dealing with these day in, day out. And because it's not just about what the legislation itself says. I mean, that's important, but it's also, how is it being implemented? And it sounds like the word that comes to mind is Wild West. I'm going to hand over to Kritika, and we're going to hear a little bit about how Shahi has been preparing for this Wild West. And then I know there's a lot of questions coming in. So as I said, at the end, we'll come back to the questions after we've heard from Kritika and from Patricia to get to some of these questions. And so with that, Kritika, I invite you to take over.
Thank you, Kim. Okay, we can move to the first slide. So hello everyone, I'm Kritika. I'm the Sustainability Manager at Shahi Exports. Amongst other things, I'm working in the area of traceability. Now with over 5 decades of expertise in just apparel manufacturing, Shahi is the largest apparel manufacturer and exporter in India. Today, I'm excited to share how we have prepared to address the critical challenges in due diligence and ethical sourcing as a company. At Shahi, we understand that how vital it is to align with global standards. So a key milestone for us this year was achieving the YES conformance in our knitting mill. We became the first mill in India to achieve this milestone. Now, building on to those insights we have gained from the YES program, which you will just know about in a little bit from Patricia, we expanded our efforts with several other critical key steps, which you can see on your screen. So starting with collaborative alignment, we have internal capacity such as sustainability teams, compliance team, procurement and production teams who work together to streamline and align on due diligence practices. So it's very important to bring your internal intelligence all together to work on these projects. When it comes to global compliance, we have aligned our processes with OECD guidelines and the UFLPA documentation requirements. And we're also closely following the banned entity list that the UFLPA releases. We have also formalized a responsible sourcing policy to reinforce our ethical procurement practices amongst our vendor base. To equip our teams for success, we also conduct regular targeted trainings for sourcing procurement teams on topics such as global due diligence standards. And lastly, to strengthen our supply chain partnerships, we enhanced our supplier vetting processes, also called as the Know Your Supplier forms. And we also introduced two-way communication tools to foster trust and collaboration amongst our upstream suppliers. These efforts reflect our commitment to meeting expectations in responsible sourcing and compliance. Now, these are some efforts that Shahi has taken. There are more, but these are the ones that I wanted to highlight today in the webinar. We can move to the next slide. Now, the journey of due diligence and traceability is dynamic and it's also ever evolving. So in this slide, I'll walk you through some of the key challenges that we have faced along the way. First, there's the complexity of the global cotton supply chain. With so many intermediaries involved, achieving full transparency and traceability can feel like almost navigating a whole maze. So the intricacy of these networks makes it one of the most significant hurdles we have to first address. Then there's the challenge of adapting to rapidly changing international laws like the UFLPA, EU directives, and certain other upcoming directives in the same area. These regulations actually require you to constantly keep on building your capacity and aligning yourself and your company to those upcoming regulations. Another ongoing challenge is supplier engagement. Many supply chains are unorganized or semi-organized, with operations almost scattered across diverse regions in the globe. So establishing a consistent and meaningful communication with your suppliers is absolutely essential. Finally, we're also navigating the rise of innovative technologies like genetic tracing, physical tracers, advanced data management tools. So while these solutions offer us immense potential, it's very important to decide which technology actually best fits for us, and also managing the financial investment that they require. It can add another layer of complexity onto this journey. So these challenges may seem daunting, but they also present an opportunity for all of us to collaborate, to innovate, and progress towards transparency. We can move to the next slide. So to wrap up, I wanted to share a few recommendations for other fellow manufacturers who are navigating these complexities of sustainability and ethical sourcing. Now, these insights come from our own journey at Shahi Exports, and I hope they also resonate with you. So starting with industry standards and strong policies that we need to build, embracing industry standards like YES is a great way to identify gaps early on and set yourself up for long-term progress. So we shouldn't think that once something is fully fleshed and it's mature and you have to do it, that's the time you get onto it. It's always good to start early, so you already know the gaps that you want to address. So starting on early would be one recommendation. Now, these frameworks also provide valuable guidance and benchmark that Patricia will just share with you in the next slide. Alongside that, creating and enforcing responsible sourcing policies is very essential, and we have done that aligning with the OECD guidelines. So they overall help you, be consistent with ethical practices that the global standards have set. Second point is building meaningful partnership with your suppliers and your supply chain. So the strength of your supply chain depends on the relationships that we cultivate in the journey. At Shahi, for example, we collaborate with the Fashion Producers Collective, which gives us a platform to openly share challenges and solutions with other fellow suppliers. Now, this kind of a trust building foster space actually gives mutual growth, and strong partnerships actually surface many solvable solutions that as industry we're solving very, in silos. So we all come together and solve those problems. So Fashion Producers Collective has given us one such platform. Similarly, your relationship with your supply chain is also very, very important. It ensures, so we can achieve this by ensuring we have open and effective communication channels with all of our supply chain, because sometimes what happens is we might know the impact of a regulation, but our upstream supply chain or our downstream supply chain might not know. So it's always good to have that open communication, that everybody is on the same page, because these are challenges we as an industry need to solve as opposed to different tiers. Now, the third point is leveraging diverse expertise across team. As I was mentioning a little while ago, that sustainability challenges often require a multidisciplinary approach. So bringing together experts from sustainability, compliance, procurement, marketing, legal teams will help you address those challenges. So teams within the companies, they don't need to feel that they need to solve the challenge by themselves. They can always use the internal intelligence that they already have in the company. Now, last but not the least important point is right technology for your needs. So with so many tools available, as I was just mentioning, genetic tracing, physical tracers, data management platforms, it is essential to evaluate and select the right technology that fits your organization's need. This ensures you're not only enhancing your traceability, transparency, but also using resources efficiently and avoiding unnecessary financial strain. On the right side of the screen, you will see a diagram. It's a very simple depiction of the steps that you need to follow to bring due diligence in your company. It starts with a step called Know Your Supplier, and then identifying red flags and ensuring that those red flags are actually potential risks for you. So all of those steps you need to do one by one. Finally, mitigating that harm, which is, of course, the most important step. So if you see what due diligence really means, is these 4 basic steps. Now, these steps will have further sub-steps that we can sit with an expert in this area and understand and decode for ourselves. This is what Shahi has been following for their own due diligence and traceability efforts. Now, this journey doesn't come without challenges, but it's all worth it by fostering collaboration and embracing innovation and building robust systems for ourselves. We can create a supply chain that will positively affect the environment, but also the society that we work with. So that was a quick snap of what Shahi has been doing in this area and what we want to recommend to other fellow suppliers. If there are any questions, I can, of course, address them towards the end. I'll hand over to Patricia.
Thank you, Kritika. I have to be quite quick because, yes, there's lots of questions, and I know everybody has them. You could go to the next slide. Thank you all for attending today. It's great to be here. Next slide. What YES is about: yarn ethically and sustainably sourced. is it is a industry-wide due diligence program specifically focused on spinning mills and fabric mills so that they can address forced labor in cotton production. And how that happens, it happens with cascading it and really looking at how the sourcing is happening. So, but our intention is really to empower mills so that they can understand what they're supposed to be doing, how to implement a due diligence system, also how to work together. Part of doing risk prevention and mitigation is collaborating with your peers, with local governments, with civil society. And so we want to encourage that. And once these concepts, these basic concepts of due diligence of how to identify and address that risk and that harm, as Kritika was saying, is that the same concepts can be applied to other risks, whether those are environmental or social, other product. The concepts of overall due diligence are basically the same. Next slide. And I'm going to try not to repeat everything that Harold and Kritika said because they both gave you very great information. I've mentioned that we're focused on spinning mills and fabric mills. You have the downstream suppliers with your retailers and brands. Even we consider tier one manufacturers or the cut and sew manufacturers, tier one for brands, all it being further downstream. And we know there's a lot of upstream initiatives as well, better cotton and fair trade, et cetera. But we're focused on, we know that at spinning mill, you lose traceability to farm, especially there where, as Harold was saying, that cotton is commingled. I haven't heard yet about the commingled of, or I've heard about it, but Harold didn't mention as much commingling inside the bale, the cumbernail of short fibers, which is another whole layer. Maybe we don't tell customs about that one, but I'm sure it's going to be coming up sooner rather than later. So we're focused on the middle tier of the supply chain. Next slide. Because they're considered a key control point. And the way we look at it is that yes can be a gatekeeper where the mills that go through our program and become conformant, like Shahi, is that they cannot source any of the prohibited material coming into the warehouse at all. And so, or if it's coming in, if you find out that you had it, you didn't realize it, I would try to use it and ship it not to the United States, but use it for some other client as quickly as possible, and then don't source it anymore. With yes, we're trying to assist mills in learning about and abiding by the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the UFLPA, as well as overall due diligence legislation coming out of Europe, which I know one of the other webinars was about that. And there is another one also from the US, which is referred to as a withhold release order. Turkmenistan is on the list for all Turkmen cotton and cotton product and cotton inputs. And so Turkmenistan is also on a list that you would not want to source any cotton or cotton inputs from there. So what our approach is that we check all the transaction documents. We make sure that the mills are not sourcing from these prohibited regions. But then there's, and then working toward the more sustainable, ethical cotton. But we know conventional is still part of it all, right? And there are still other risky areas, not just the Xinjiang Uyghur region or Turkmenistan. I mean, Uzbekistan is still somewhat risky. And so this approach of constantly looking for, okay, knowing your supplier, looking for red flags. What if that there is a risky possibility of forced labor, at farm level? What do you do about it? How do you work with the GINs and others in your own supply chain to address those issues? Next slide. So we develop standards. We have 2 standards. Oops, sorry, I guess I took that one out. But we created standards both for spinning mills and fabric mills. And this is to walk you through the whole program. And so we don't have time here to go through it. The standards are on our website. You can see them there. And if you look at the UFLPA has put out something referring, it's guidance for importers that the Customs Department and kind of the collaborative at the government, a U.S. government put together. And this is the overall kind of due diligence expectations that are laid out in those in that guidance for importers, as well as around what the expectations are for supply chain tracing, and also then the supply chain management measures, a lot of that which Harold went into in more detail. So, you know, we're, as I mentioned, YES is really looking at how these entities are sourcing. This guidance is written from the perspective of a brand or whoever's actually importing the product into the United States. But the same concepts can be applied to yourselves, how you're managing the same thing, engaging your stakeholders, you know, how you're mapping your suppliers, the know your supplier code of conduct. We kind of equate the standards we developed to a code of conduct because we're not looking at labor conditions inside the spinning or fabric facility. We're only concerned at this moment as to the labor conditions inside the cotton that you're sourcing, which means that you need to be asking more questions of your suppliers and also their understanding if there's exposure to risk. So there's the other aspect that's requirement for a standard is that you put up your own responsible sourcing policy on your own website, as well as your own due diligence report, talking about how you're implementing all these various components. So I think it's really great that Transformers Foundation is putting out all these different fact sheets, because you shouldn't treat them in silos. You know, work with them together and understand, you know, there are due diligence requirements for UFLPA that can also meet the due diligence requirements for European shipments. That law just passed earlier this year. It doesn't go into effect till 2027, but get started now. This stuff takes time to go through all of it. And it is all very much focused on risk mitigation, as I mentioned, identifying the red flags and tracking your inputs through the processes. All right, Kim came on, so I'll just speed up here, talk really quick, and I think you all get copies of the slides, right? How we work with mills, we offer training, support, there is an annual assessment, there's expectation, oh, next slide, on continuous improvement. And then the next slide is who we're working with today. We've started a multi-stakeholder membership for mills as well as brands. So you can start to see them there. We have a public list of the mills that have also just started to go through the program, whether they are just participating, joining as members, or if they've actually been assessed. And more details are available to member only. It's not all out there, but at least this gets you started. And at the end, next slide, my contact information. So if you want to learn more about our YES program, feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you, Patricia. Also, I mean, both you and Harold were impressively coherent given the ungodly hour. So we're really grateful that you were here to share your expertise with us. There are a lot of questions that have come in. I'm going to invite all of the panelists to turn your cameras back on, and we're going to kind of tackle these questions as a group. And I'm going to open with the question on there's kind of, and this maybe relates in some ways to the YES program, Patricia, but I'm curious to hear from both you, Patricia, and Harold, your perspectives on this. There's a question from Jorge about, you know, like OCS or GOT certification, you know, is this something that could help? And there's another question in the chat from Liliana, which says, does the factory being certified or segregating cotton actually help with the commingling issue? And I'm curious, like, your thoughts, Harold, Patricia, and actually also Crispin, who's here from Sourcery, who works very closely with farmers. Like, do these certifications actually help, or is this just a total Wild West? You know, it's kind of like a bit of a crapshoot or a gamble as to whether these things help. So I'm going to start with Harold, then Patricia, and then Crispin, and then Kritika, and anyone else. If you want to jump in, you are most welcome.
You know, I would never discourage anyone from being certified. I don't think any of it helps. We've had a situation where we actually had U.S. cotton with the Cotton Council certifications, bail numbers, etc. And in a seizure, in a detention situation, Customs said, how do we know it hasn't been commingled? And when you get unreasonable positions like that, you simply have to accept that it is the Wild West. But all the same, having the credentials never hurts. There may be an evolution at some point in the way Customs deals with this, so that companies that have appropriate programs and appropriate tracing will rebut the presumption, and in the absence of real evidence, Customs should release their products. And at this time, that's just not the case.
And I would say that,
Patricia.
yeah, organic does not have labor requirements or checking on that. I know Better Cotton does have decent work, but still a lot of work to do there. But what it is giving you is that experience with segregating product, of tracking documentation. And like Harold said, you know, that is all going to be useful in how you are managing your documents and the process, so that you can actually disclose the information that they're looking for, those bail IDs, you know, through the laydown. Maybe you change the bail ID when it arrives at your warehouse, so you need to be, you know, mapping that out. So all of those data points are important to track, and those other certifications are going to help you with that.
One other comment, if I may. I mean, what we've advised in other industries where factories were shipping around the world, as well as the United States, and where they received material that was subject to forced labor questions, we advised that they very carefully trace those materials and what production it went into. And we were actually able to present Customs with a chart and documentation supporting the fact that the actual prohibited material was used elsewhere and shipped elsewhere, which was helpful.
Crispin.
Yeah, I think just to add to the standard thing, you know, we have to really understand the value of standards. Standards are risk compliance. They are a protocol, if you want to call it that, or you know, it's managing risk, it's insurance. I think we have to look at standards, you know, as a tool that is necessary, as YES is and other standards that exist. But the way that we at Sourcery like to think of them is they're a snapshot in time. They're a still photograph. But what the United States Customs Department, what the European Union is really asking the supply chain is for a raw footage, a raw movie reel of what's happening in your value chain across every transaction, every level of the value chain at all times, and then taking that raw movie reel and looking clip by clip by clip by clip, and then allowing them to make those decisions that, yes, in fact, you know, the evidence is there within the real, not just a snapshot in time that is coming from the viewpoint of a particular auditor or a particular standard. As Patricia said, today BCI includes in their frame some reference to social compliance. Is it weak? Probably, but it still is something, versus organic doesn't have any social and labor at the farm level, where we know that organic, in fact, requires so much more labor than does conventional cotton because of the absence of a lot of crop chemistry that prevents, that takes the necessity away from constant weeding and other things of that nature. So I think we really have to look at things more as we enter this new era, as Harold, you mentioned in your comments, we have to look at the tools out there to move away from that snapshot in time and be able to record the supply chain as a movie reel and understand what that looks like. And that comes, of course, with risks, not only to the brands that are buying it because we don't want every frame recorded, but it also comes with a huge amount of burden to the value chain, because the fact is that, you know, as much as Shahi might be selling to 10 of the major brands, are also selling to 200 other small brands, and at the same time probably buying product from 200, 300 traders, manufacturers, all the way down to the farm level. And if you look at the Indian context, it takes 10,000 farmers between around 100 villages to produce the amount of cotton that is processed in a single gin. So you can imagine the gravity of what we're talking about to get that level of visibility. That movie reel is immense, and it's fascinating, you know.
Can I ask a question, since I've been answering them? Have any of you had any ability to reach into cotton farming in China and develop information there? I mean, that's of real interest to me.
Yes. About 4 years ago, before we pulled out of China at Sourcery, we were in the Hebei in the Shandong province, and we were actually sourcing from Xinjiang a little bit, to be fair, before a lot of the I guess the logic. Our auditors on the ground were chased out. I'll leave it at that. They were intimidated. They were pushed out, and I said to the team at the time, "We're not doing it. We can't expose our business and our clients' business to that liability."
And there's two sort of related questions, which I'm going to put on the table at once, just as in the interest of time. One is about, it's from Chu Wang, which says, how can a company sourcing from China prove the lack of forced labor without discriminating Chinese suppliers that do not engage in forced labor? And so here there's a question as to, like, okay, well, where does this legislation actually apply to? And also, if people are moving out of Xinjiang, like, how do you account for that? And there's a related question from Jorge Delgado, which is, which regions are actually banned as per the UFLPA? Xinjiang, we've heard Turkmenistan. So maybe, Harold, I'm going to throw this question to you. And if anybody else wants to jump in, you are most welcome.
If you're producing in China, the rules are really the same for production in China as they are anywhere else, other than the ability to provide data is more inhibited. I mean, there are in other situations with other products involving truly tens and tens of millions of dollars, we've gone to raw material producers who say, we can't answer you. We can't provide any information in connection with a forced labor inquiry, because that would violate the law. So there are inherent problems in China in terms of being able to gather data. So that's a problem. But if you're producing in China and you can develop strong paperwork, and you can really develop data as to where your cotton is being grown and where it's being made, you know, you have the same chance as anybody else of surviving a detention. And you know, cotton, we're now starting to hear customs talking about labor being moved around China and being used in different areas. So it's going to get harder and harder to say you can buy cotton here, you can buy cotton here, you can buy, because in China that's becoming more and more of a problem. Certainly Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan and you know, other cotton growing places are always interesting, but you've got Turkey, you've got Egypt, where you can be generally comfortable that there is no issue. But then again, you don't know what customs is going to find and how they're going to deal with it. But for the moment, there are comfort zones which are outside of the stands and which are outside of China. But it again goes back to commingling, and is the producer you're dealing with selling to other markets where they're getting cotton that is problematic? That may have been a long way to get to what should have been a shorter answer, sorry.
And
No,
there
Where
is
is
an
it?
entity
Yeah,
list.
Patricia.
So make sure you're not sourcing off the entity list.
Yeah,
Which
well,
are
okay.
facilities in other parts of China, as you know. So that's kind of like your baseline.
But it's worse than that, really, because you may be dealing with an entity that is not on the entity list, but may have some tangential cross shareholding or some director in common, and the next thing you know, you're treated like you're on the entity list. So it's problematic.
I think just to add, Kim, to that very briefly, I know I can be a bit loquacious, but we have to include in these discussions the economics of compliance. And the reason why is just like the United States subsidizes its cotton farmers, China also subsidizes not only its cotton farmers, but its cotton finance. So it's much cheaper for a Chinese firm to buy Chinese cotton than it is to buy American cotton or Brazilian cotton or Indian cotton. Okay, that's a major thing. It's actually also much cheaper for Bangladesh and India and Pakistan to buy Chinese cotton and yarn than it is to buy their own yarn today. That's the truth. And so naturally, a facility who is pressured by pricing is going to go to where we go and market is the cheapest place. We want to go to the Walmarts or the Sheins to get the same product because our margins are increased. Yet at the same time, that exposes us to risk. And a lot of the manufacturers that we work with, they look at risk and they say, we're willing to take this risk on this order because we're saving 20 cents on that cotton on a per kilogram basis. Therefore, if we get caught, well, sorry, at least we made our money and we can defend ourselves. So it's really quite important to include these economic conversations that often get left out of the ethical compliance discussions because ethics and compliance cost money.
We have so many more questions that we didn't get to. I want to close by just really recommending to everybody who's here and whose questions we didn't get to go and look at the fact sheet in the guide, because a lot of the answers, there's questions in here around scope, around documentation, around, you know, all kinds of different pieces. Oh, you see the QR code on the screen. It's the one on the left. But please go and look at the fact sheet. You can also reach out. Patricia's put her contact information, and I'm sure you can reach out to Harold as well. So please do that. And I want to thank everybody, especially Patricia and Harold, who are here at 4 o'clock in the morning, for joining us today. And I want to thank everybody here on this webinar for taking an hour out of your day to be with us. And yeah, I know it's overwhelming, and I don't even know if it's possible to be compliant. There was a comment on that as well. But I hope that the guide and this session provides just like a little bit of tangible insight. And thank you, of course, also to Shahi, who came in and shared a bit about their efforts, because it's not easy. And it's also speaking about their challenges. It's not easy. And I don't think anyone has this figured out. And so a willingness to come up and say that is much appreciated. So with that, you'll get the recording. If you have more questions or want to be connected to anyone, just reach out. And hopefully we'll see you in January. I think it's in January for our next webinar on the eco-design. Thank you very much.
Great
everyone.
fun.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.